and we need to have some data that we arm ourselves with so we can address it. That's all. I'm not saying it's biologically sound. I'm just saying that we need data to argue against it any more than, vaccines cause autism was biologically sound. We just need data to address it. That's all I'm saying.
I agree. Thank you. I think we agree perception is everything. Facts may be important, but perception drives a lot of decisions. Dr. Annunziato.
Thank you. I have a question for Dr. Bill Gruber. Bill, in your study, can you describe for us how the non-solicited adverse experiences that were collected up until 1 month after dose 2 were collected? In other words, was there active surveillance for those events as well? And then for your plans for under an EUA, if a subject is unblinded and vaccinated, could you also just reiterate for us what safety surveillance you will be conducting in that situation?
Yes, thanks, Paula. I may call upon Nick Kitchen to help with some of the details. He's the clinical lead for the program. But the e-diary information was solicited and collected for the first 7 days. And then investigators were encouraged to essentially collect adverse events, but in an unsolicited fashion for the first month after administration. And then, I'm sorry, the second question was what again?
What are the plans for safety collection for the subjects who may opt to be unblinded and then vaccinated after the EUA is issued?
Right. So I'm going to defer to Dr. Kitchen, who's helped put together our latest amendment that deals with management of the placebo recipients, to perhaps address both questions, but particularly the second one. Dr. Kitchen.
Thank you, Bill. This is Nick Kitchen from Pfizer. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, yes. So with respect to elicitation of adverse events, and specifically the reactogenicity type events that you were asking about for subjects that were not in the subset, they were elicited in the same way as other adverse events. There weren't specific leading or directed questions to elicit specifically for those events, and that's why you would typically would expect to see them seeing at a lower rate when reported as adverse events rather than when as actively solicited daily for 7 days immediately after vaccination in the diary. So for reactogenicity, the data from the subset gives us the best picture of the profile. With respect to our plans for safety surveillance for subjects that would be receiving the BNT162b2 as a result of being eligible, for example, under EUA, our intention is to use the same safety surveillance as those not in the subset. So we would not use e-diaries for those subjects that were moving across, but they would have all adverse events elicited for 1 month after what would be their 4th vaccination, but their 2nd active dose, and 6 months for serious adverse.
I might just add, Paul, as you can well recognize, 8,000 subjects set for common events that are being solicited routinely, like fever, headache, fatigue, the chills. We probably have, in fact, I would argue we do have sufficient precision on those common sorts of events. So it makes less sense, I think, to essentially say, you come back and you also now have to essentially do the e-diaries again. I don't think it really will add value, and it potentially could mitigate against individuals wanting to participate.
Sure. Thank you.
Dr. Lee.
So my question is really for Pfizer about their blinded follow-up or unblinding the placebo recipients. And I think one question I have is why in your unblinding is there not incorporated some sort of scale or whatever you want to call it for severity grade or risk factor, either based on age, comorbidity, or so forth. Instead, you're relying on local and national guidelines, and I can tell you they're going to vary state by state, county by county here, and you're going to have a hodgepodge. So it seems if you were going to incorporate something about the risk factors, you might have a little bit more consistency on the follow-up of various risk groups, and I didn't know if Pfizer had considered that at all.
Glad you asked
maybe
that
Dr. N.
question because it moves us back to the discussion topics. Can we have Pfizer responding, please?
Yes, could I please ask Dr. Ann Madsen to explain in detail how we are going to follow vaccine recipients over time?
No, it wasn't the question. It wasn't the question of follow-up. It was a question of identifying when somebody would be eligible to be unblinded that would include their risk factors, not just local and national criteria, because they will vary tremendously in this country and I suspect elsewhere.
Okay,
Yeah.
then maybe Dr. Gruber, please.
Yeah,
respond.
yeah. And I may call upon Nick to help with this too. We obviously, as you heard this morning from Dr. Goodman, this is an incredibly challenging area for us to, put forward the right path. We want to be conscientious about providing vaccine to individuals that would qualify. So the onus is on us to take the EU, the emergency use authorization and the recommendations to heart. If you happen to live in an area where, in fact, you are eligible, we'd be hard-pressed to say, well, because we've taken a national recommendation, you don't fit because we're just going by the national recommendations. I think we have yet to see how that will work in practice, but it is our intent to try to do what we think is right to follow the guidance and local recommendations. We're also obviously facing this, as you can perceive, not just on a national level, but internationally, since we have a number of countries involved. So we have to look at each of those issues and weigh them to make that type of decision. I don't know, Nick, if you have anything else to add to that.
I know that you will be in discussion, Bill, with FDA about these. Well,
right. I mean, that's clearly a part and parcel of why I'm glad this is a topic for discussion.
Exactly.
Yeah, Bill. Sorry, Bill. Yeah, this is Nick Kitchen again from Pfizer. Just to add, so yes, our intention, at least initially, would be we would anticipate, in terms of the recommendations, following the initial ACIP recommendations. So we will provide specific guidance, more specific than applying to local and national recommendations. But certainly to start with, I imagine it would follow how ACIP would recommend allocation of the doses.
Thank you. And as we go forward, please mainly pay attention to the discussion items, because as many have stated, we'd like to move to a BLA submission promptly, or as smoothly, I won't say promptly, as smoothly as possible. And the answer to some of these issues is going to affect that. So, Dr. Moore.
Hi, yes. One question that addresses these two discussion items that I find is really, really central and important is that FDA did not ask in its guidance, and Pfizer has presented no evidence in its data today that the vaccine has any effect on virus carriage or shedding, which is the fundamental basis for herd immunity. And so even though the individual efficacy of this vaccine is very, very, very high, we really, as of right now, do not have any evidence that it will have an impact on social-wide on the epidemic. And so I would like to ask, before the unblinding, that Pfizer seriously consider performing nucleic acid assays on the vaccinees and the placebo patients. I don't know whether the point estimate for shedding is going to be high enough that you're going to see a significant difference. But at least one should try, because that's the one piece of data that we're going to completely lose once the unblinding occurs.
Let me just interrupt and tell you that these questions are being addressed by CDC in the observational studies as we go forward, because of sample size issues and a lot of issues that are not possible when you're not looking at households where transmission will take place.
Right. In my discussions with the CDC, they certainly would like to have a toe-in to the vaccine companies to be able to help perform these very types of studies, if at all possible. And so that industry CDC collaboration would be tremendous, but it is so important as of right now as to whether or not this vaccine can have an impact on non-vaccinated persons who are at risk for acquiring an infection. We don't know that.
Dr. Jansen, you want to comment?
Yes, we actually are looking into this to do precisely that, not just to look for a prevention of asymptomatic infection, but also doing the PCR testing to look for virus acquisition or prevention of virus acquisition. I may remind, though, that we have data, not from humans, but from our non-human primate study, that would argue that the vaccine does prevent infection. We have seen that it prevents infection of the lung, and we actually have also seen some evidence that it has a more transient, that virus is more transiently detected in the vaccinated animals compared to the control animals.
Yes, but in human
okay, we're going to have to move. We're going to have to move on. Dr. Kim.
I think this relates to discussion item number 2. Vaccine efficacy data might not be evident for the for HIV-positive study participants, given their small number, but presumably preliminary vaccine safety data are available. After all, trial participants were enrolled in October, and EUA application was made on November 20th. Would Pfizer please comment, are there any updated information, since people with HIV infection or other conditions that are stable and meet the criteria for vaccination will be standing in line for the vaccine in short time?
Bill, could you please comment?
Yes. So obviously, we included individuals, as I mentioned and Dr. Jansen mentioned, with HIV, HCV, and HBV if they had stable infection. And we've obviously included additional evaluations of that group beyond the core group that we're looking for solicited, unsolicited adverse events. Within the population that we have so far, we have within the 38K database, about 120 of these and 196 in the total 43,000 plus database. So we're getting to a point where we will have enough of those individuals to look at, and we would propose, obviously, doing that in association with the filing that goes into the BLA, if not sooner. We just need to have enough of them. As you may know, we amended the protocol in flight, so there was a little bit of delay. That was really the only population apart from the 12 to 15-year-olds, and that were a little bit delayed in terms of enrollment in the trial because of the way that was staggered. But yes, it is our intent to essentially have more information on that population.
Okay, Dr. Pergam. Dr.
Thanks. So I had a question about, since this vaccine is going to be rolled out through the EUA, there's going to be a fair number of people who might have access to the vaccine who've had previous COVID exposure, may not know they've been positive, or have known history of positivity. There's limited data in the trial, at least, because of enrollment for people that are previously positive. So the two questions kind of relating to both of these questions is, thinking about potentially looking at side effects within the group that potentially gets this. Is there an increased enhancement of side effects? Didn't look like it in the initial data you showed, but looking at that a little more carefully in people that have known prior positivity. And then secondarily, I'm curious, what are you going to do with patients in the clinical trial who did develop COVID? Are they going to also be offered the vaccine? Just as a question for Pfizer.
Jansen, I think you're muted.
Not exactly an advertisement for Adobe Connect.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you, Catherine.
Yeah, so I think we may have lost the link.
No, we can hear you.
Oh, you know?
Okay.
Oh, good. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I would like to take the first part of the question and then have Dr. Gruber comment on the second one. So while we have excluded individuals with known COVID-19, so meaning PCR confirmed COVID-19, we actually do have in our trial individuals that are seropositive. In other words, they were prior exposed to COVID-19. And so our estimate is about 2 to 3% of the individuals that were participating in our trials were seropositive at baseline. Bill, if you want to take the second.
Yeah, so I think the second question was about the nature of the safety profile in individuals that had evidence of prior SARS coronavirus infection or were PCR positive at the time they appeared for their first or second dose. And the bottom line is, and this has been submitted to the FDA, if you just separate out that group, and again, it's a small proportion of the total population, but still fairly sizable when you look at the total group. We had, I guess, well over 150, I think, in the reactogenicity subset and over 500 in the larger database of looking at unsolicited adverse events. And when you compare that to the individuals that had no prior evidence of infection, it looks basically the same. I mean, point estimates actually look a little bit better, but obviously within the realm of statistical significance, we can't make much of that. But clearly, these individuals did not fare worse from the vaccine. And I think we've not seen anything in terms of, as those individuals have tracked through the study, a particularly high attack rate or severe disease that would suggest to us that there's a problem in that group.
Okay, Dr. Carrillo. One part only.
Thank you. If Pfizer were to receive an EUA and you lost all of the participants in the trial who were healthcare workers, would the remainder still allow you to have be adequately powered to carry on? That would be my first question. The other is...
I said one part only.
Well, I'm just going to put my hand up again then.
Well, then you'll go to the bottom of the queue. Okay,
okay, well,
please. That's an important question.
So I would like to have Bill address this, and then we may also need help from Dr. Ken Curry.
Yeah, so thanks, Catherine. So I think it's our current estimate, as best we can determine, that about maybe 20% or something north of that may fit into the health provider category. However, that still leaves, of course, 80%. given the high attack rate, presuming that those placebo recipients remained in the trial for a while longer, we know that we would be in a good position, particularly sadly given the high attack rate, that we could still track out and get a good measure both for safety and efficacy over the longer term. I think the bigger challenge really relates to how quickly the CDC moves forward to the additional tiers and how quickly those populations again get encompassed within emergency use authorization and will be covered if we conform to the plan that we've outlined. But it's my sense, and I'll ask Ken Curry, who's our head of stats, just to comment on this, but it's my sense that yes, even with 20% loss, we won't have that much difficulty. If we were sort of in the 50 to 60% efficacy category, that could potentially prove more challenging. I don't know, Dr. Curry.
Yeah, hi, this is Ken Corey. I lead the vaccine statistics at Pfizer, and those answers are correct. The study is well positioned to continue to accrue more cases and to be able to answer some of these questions with more precision.
Thank you, Dr. Hildreth. And please, let's keep it mainly to the discussion items.
Thank you, Dr. Montreux. My question is for Pfizer, and it relates to the recruitment of minorities into the study, which is relevant to number 2. My understanding is that the minorities were recruited fairly late in the process. So do we have an adequate follow-up to that group compared to the majority of the participants? The 2-month median is what I'm referring to. Can someone address that for me? Thank you.
Yeah, I'd like Dr. Gruber to comment on the demographics.
Thanks, Jefferson. Let me correct one perhaps incorrect assumption, which is that we actually from the very start were focused on targeting in recruitment from racial and ethnic minorities. But what we decided to do after we proved successful in terms of the overall success in getting to 30,000 and then deciding how to move forward, we decided at that point, given that we'd had some success, but we wanted to have more, we actually informed sites that to preferentially, beyond what they'd already done, any new recruitment that they provided was really targeted to minority communities. So it was a fact that we started from the very beginning, but then we further enriched at the end. So I would say you could feel confident that minority communities were recruited throughout, perhaps with a bit more towards the end. But I'm convinced, and I think the data supports that we had individuals from those communities followed for a long enough time, certainly to demonstrate efficacy. Within the limits, of course, of some of the groups having a smaller number of total cases. But it's not the right assumption that we didn't start from the very beginning. That was a key ingredient we advertised, both on our websites and everywhere else that we could, about our intent to bring people of color into the trial.
Okay, Dr. Levy, on the discussion items, please.
Hi. My webcam isn't working. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We don't need to see you.
Okay, fair enough. So my question is in terms of gaps. This is a very big picture question. If we want to have a safe and effective vaccine deployed and make a huge dent in this pandemic, eventually what will be needed is high vaccine penetrance, right? 60, 70, 80% of the vulnerable population immunized. Would we realistically get there given the structure of the United States and the tendency of adults in the United States? Would we realistically get there without a pediatric vaccine? And I realize there are all sorts of challenges and hurdles and counter arguments, but I'd be interested to hear from FDA and Pfizer if they've given long-term thought to the ultimate end game here, because if there were a safe and effective pediatric vaccine, obviously the infrastructure for vaccine delivery and penetration of vaccine is very favorable in that regard. Thank you.
Let's keep the answers relatively short. That's a very big question. So Pfizer pediatric plans?
Bill, you want to take that?
Sure, I'm happy to. We obviously recognize the importance of moving into the pediatric population, and I touched base on this briefly in the main presentation. We thought so strongly about this that, as you know, we obviously are trying to seek an indication in 16 to 17-year-olds, which we think is supported by what you've heard from us and the FDA. In addition to which, we already have 12 to 15-year-olds in the trial, which not only inform the ability to move forward in that group where we're going to recruit 2,000 individuals, but actually also the preliminary information which we submitted to the FDA from the first 100 individuals looks quite good compared to the reactogenicity we're seeing in 18 to 25 and 18 to 55-year-olds. So we're already embarking on that path, and then it's our intention, if all continues to go well, and so far it has from a safety point of view, to move down to 5 to 11-year-olds based on the nature of the data becoming available, the completion of where we are with the 12 to 15-year-olds. We anticipate that that will commence by April of 2020. And the idea would be to start there, and then, as is typical for pediatric trials, once we have documented safety in that group, move down. It's our expectation, although I'm encouraged that it might not necessarily be the case, that we may need to do dose ranging in the 5 to 11-year-olds. We thought that might happen in the 12 to 15, but they seem to tolerate the 30 microgram well. Once we move down to 5 to 11, we'll be very judicious, just as we were in the 12 to 15, doing a small sample of sentinels and then working our way down. And then ultimately, we propose to move down in younger age groups below 5 years of age. And again, we do that in a judicious fashion.
Dr. Krause.
Additional comment, if I can, on behalf of FDA, and that is that the Pediatric Research Equity Act actually requires there to be a plan for evaluating products in pediatric patients and in children. But of course, there's also a requirement that you can't do research in children unless you have a prospect of benefit. And so you can't do these studies initially in children, but I think moving quickly now that benefit of the vaccine has been established is a very reasonable thing to do. That's something that we'll be working with the sponsor on. I'm wondering, while I have the floor though, that I might drive things back towards the actual discussion items a little bit more directly.
Thank you.
And in that regard, we heard this morning from Dr. Goodman suggestion that we might look towards, instead of an unblinding, when people become eligible for receipt of a vaccine outside of a trial, a crossover design in which blinding is maintained. And of course, if one is to do something like that, that then is the last opportunity in which one might be able to draw a serum on people in the trial in order to determine whether they've seroconverted, which would then give a chance to look at the question raised earlier as to whether or not people have gotten infected while one still can compare a vaccine versus placebo. So I don't know if anyone at Pfizer is prepared to opine on this, but do these seem like reasonable things for you to do, to, instead of unblinding, to do a crossover when people become eligible for a vaccine, but also to draw a serum on these individuals before that happens, to allow for this kind of additional look at the last moment before the placebos then, in essence, disappear, and one then loses that opportunity to compare, also in the blood, what happened to vaccinees versus placebo recipients.
I can take that first question and comment. So we are fully planning to actually do the analysis of vaccine protection against asymptomatic infection very soon, as I noted, probably beginning of or in very early in 2021. And so we can take under advisement to see if there is an opportunity or value based on our routine serum sample that we do in the participants anyway, even additional blood draw would be of value. And then for the blinding question that you have, I would also give it back to Dr. Gruber to comment.
Yes, thanks, Catherine. Obviously, the considerations that were discussed by Dr. Goodman have been front and center for us in thinking about how we would move forward. We have looked at the issue of a potential crossover, and although there is some potential advantage, I think some things that are being advertised may be sort of a false premise. Once, for instance, individuals know that they've received vaccine in both groups, you sort of, have essentially, equalize them in terms of their perception about whether they need to come in for illness visits or not. So that's a challenge. Deferral, in the circumstances is not an option for ACIP recommended groups. So that's a challenge in terms of obviously solving for our ethical obligations to vaccinate folks. There's also the logistic approach. As I mentioned, when we're enrolling 22,000 individuals, somebody has to be first in line. We can't bring them all in, on day one. So the idea was, okay, with the EUA authorization, we can kind of bring them in as that authorization and recommendation expands. On the other hand, if you're talking about a crossover where everybody is now going to have to come in for 2 additional visits, you're talking
Well, it
now
would be
about
twice as many people, but of course, I think that what he proposed was you also only bring them in for crossover as they otherwise become eligible.
44,000 individuals would have to be brought in for 2 additional visits, and those individuals that are receiving vaccine would have to do this, in essence, be reconsented, essentially agree to come back for 2 additional visits. Now, I heard, Dr. Goodman appropriately saying that some of these people, and we would hope that this would be the case if you chose that path, would do this out of the goodness of their heart. But it does mean that they have to come back for an otherwise unintended or a visit back to a medical facility, and the risk of exposure just from that sort of experience in and of itself. So the notion of what we're concerned about is that when we add this additional piece of work that these individuals have to not only agree to, but provide informed consent for 2 additional visits, for those for both groups, that creates it potentially from their perspective, maybe the risk-benefit equation isn't such a great idea for me. I'm going to just go ahead and wait and my turn and get the vaccine. So I think those are things that the logistics are something that are not trivial, because we've got to bring in basically a lot of people to be vaccinated. And if we now add this to 88,000 visits, that's a challenge. Obviously, we enrolled 44,000 people and done 88,000 visits, but it took us a number of months to do that. And so if the notion is trying to strike the right balance between getting people timely vaccination when they're eligible, there are some advantages to be gained by just having to vaccinate the placebo recipient.
Of course, one of the questions in the way this is being put to the committee is that if you can't do this, and you then lose the ability, for instance, to look more directly at duration of efficacy, and already even in the crossover design, lose the ability to do, in many people, longer-term follow-up for safety. And of course, as it is the people who are at highest risk, who are those who are also going to be suggested for earliest vaccination, and so you'll then lose the ability in continuing your trial to look at further impact on severe disease. What are the ways in which the inability to get that information from continued follow-up in the trial will be addressed? How can the American people, as well as the FDA and the CDC recommending bodies, be sure that we have enough information to proceed with the vaccine and understand exactly what the longer-term safety, durability, and efficacy against severe disease is?
I mean, those are all reasonable questions and ones that we're wrestling with. But I think we've already sort of addressed the common reactogenicity. I don't think there's likelihood that you'll get much more precision related to that. So if you set that aside, there is this period of time where we would expect we would continue to be able to collect information as the EUA rolls out in those individuals who remain. As I said, maybe 20% of the population would be vaccinated. It will still take some time to do that. So, imagine we might be able to do that within 1 or 2 months. That's still, even within that population, a time where we would be continuing to collect cases. As far as safety is concerned, the same thing applies. You still would have a proportion of these individuals for looking for longer-term events. As we move farther and farther out, the likelihood that you've got a vaccine-related event, I think, becomes diminishingly small. Part of the reason, I think we were enamored with the idea of a median follow-up of 2 months is our perspective that if you're going to see something specifically related to vaccine, it's more likely to happen in that time span, and you've already got a significant database to look at that. So, it's my sense, and of course you don't lose the ability to look at efficacy over the long period of time. Let's suppose that all the placebo recipients ended up moving over to the trial relatively quickly. One of the key features is looking at durability of response, and you can look comparatively at the newly vaccinated. I think we heard this from Dr. Goodman this morning. You can look comparatively at the newly vaccinated compared to the previously vaccinated and determine whether or not you're beginning to see those individuals that previous vaccinees, that their curve, basically starts sloping up, and it becomes, suggesting that you're losing protection. So, based on...
Although that analysis was based on a premise of blinded follow-up.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last comment.
I think the analysis was put forward by Dr. Folman of the NIH was based on a premise of blinded follow-up, not of unblinded follow-up.
I'm talking about a circumstance where you would just be able to compare the attack rates in the respective groups based on the difference in terms of timing as far as vaccine. Of course, that's predicated on what's happening with the pandemic. I'd like nothing better than the pandemic has gone away. We did that, but I think based on what I'm hearing from the experts, some of whom we heard from today, it's our expectation over the span of time we would plan to conduct this, that we would badly be in a position where we would likely be able to determine if, in fact, those attack rates for those people that were more remotely vaccinated went up.
Okay. Going to have 2 more questions, and then we are going to move into discussion of our voting question. So Dr. Chatterjee and then Dr. Cohen.
Thank you, Dr. Monto. I'd like to address discussion item number 2. Dr. Gruber, in your presentation, slide number CC58, I believe, you spoke about different studies that Pfizer might be conducting, but I did not see long-term care facility residents listed. They are obviously at high risk because of which they're being prioritized to receive the vaccine. And the other one was inclusion of any concomitant use trials, particularly with influenza vaccines. At least in the Northern Hemisphere, this vaccine will be rolled out at a time when influenza vaccines are also being given. So does the sponsor have studies planned for those 2 populations, or those 2 types of?
So Catherine, do you want me to go ahead and take that?
So yeah, it was addressed to you, Bill.
That's okay. So let me address the second question first. I think it was on the slide. We do have a plan to potentially look at concomitant influenza vaccines, recognizing just the issue that you raised. It would be great if we find that this vaccine manages to provide protections that's durable and no one requires an additional dose. And as we said, we're going to be looking very intently at the durability of protection. But if that's not the case, and the presumption is that over the course of the coming months we'll begin to get a clue about that, then we would be considering looking at co-administration of influenza vaccine, assuming that that would be a timely period for annual vaccination if protection was not conferred. I think that the challenge that we encountered, and we thought seriously about the long-term care facilities for a prospective trial, given the nature of the closed nature of that, getting the informed consent, a lot of logistic issues. And I think this isn't unique to us. I think it's common to a number of the other sponsors, except maybe the monoclonal antibody trials. That didn't prove to be fertile ground for us to be able to move forward to get a good answer. I think we can take some comfort. In fact, I'd say a great deal of comfort when we look at the older populations that are engaged in our trial, where we're showing efficacy, particularly not only in people that are older, but people older with comorbid conditions like obesity and the Charleston comorbidity conditions that I think would translate well into a high likelihood of protecting against individuals in long-term care facilities. I might defer to Dr. Louis Jodar, who I know he and his team have thought about more long-term follow-up in terms of the nature of surveillance, and I'm sure the CDC and others will be looking at those populations as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Dr. Gruber. I'm
very brief, please.
Chief Medical Officer for vaccines. I do not have much to add, but as to say that as we plan post EUA studies in the next few weeks, the conduct of case control test negative designs in which we can measure selecting specific populations, and we are thinking very much indeed to select long-term care facilities in those studies. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cohen, and then we are going to start discussing the voting question. You're muted.
Still can't hear you, Amanda. Amanda, we can't hear you.
Okay, I apologize. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
I was wondering if you could tell us what the timelines may be for authorization or approval in the other countries that you have enrolled trial participants in, which are Argentina, Brazil, Germany, South Africa, and Turkey. And if what is the plan in terms of those countries, people continuing in this placebo randomized controlled design versus unblinding those participants as well at the same time as unblinding in the U.S.?
Bill, please take that.
Yeah, I think the brief answer is, again, our whole unblinding process is going to be done in cooperation with regulatory authorities, both here as well as elsewhere. I think we will take into account national recommendations as well as local recommendations. So it is conceivable that we would be in a position to continue individuals in a placebo-controlled fashion, in a blinded way in those countries. But we have to be mindful of the fact of our ethical obligations regardless of geography, and so it's going to involve a balance. If there's subtle differences, that's going to be probably easier for us to make those sorts of adjustments than if take healthcare providers. Chances are we might be providing this to healthcare providers, across the board. But this is something we'll engage in based on our conversation with regulatory authorities, both foreign and domestic.
Okay, thank you. We are now going to close discussion of the discussion items and move on to discussion of the voting question. And could we bring up the voting question? So anybody who has their hands raised now should lower them, because the next discussion is going to be about the voting question. And Mike, can you bring that up? think we better see it before we start talking about it. Wording is very important. And I will even read it, even though you can all read it. Based on the totality of scientific evidence available, do the benefits of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine outweigh its risks for use in individuals 16 years of age and older? Okay. Amanda, are you asking to be recognized again? Or is
Yes,
this the
thank
old
you.
one?
Nope, this is a new one. I got my hand up quickly this time.
Okay, let's start with you.
I just wanted to comment that I do believe that the benefits outweigh the risks. I think that some language that I would prefer be added to this language is based on the totality of scientific evidence available at this time. And I do want to ask FDA to comment on potential other contraindications besides history of anaphylaxis to a vaccine or warnings such as persons with a history of Bell's palsy or other things that they are including in the considerations of use.
FDA, Marion, Bill, Doron.
Hi. So this voting question is what we would like the committee to consider at this time, which is an all-inclusive authorization for ages 16 and above. If the committee has concerns that the benefit-risk balance is not able to be assessed or unfavorable, such that it would preclude inclusion of a specific subgroup, then clearly we would want to hear about that and would consider those recommendations in contraindications or in the parameters of the population authorized for use.
The question is about groups within this 16 years of age and older, such as with some kind of underlying condition. Is that usually handled by FDA with information, warnings, labels, or something like that?
Well, it depends on what the reason for concern is. So if there is a clear risk of that would make the benefit-risk balance so unfavorable that persons in that group should never be vaccinated, then that would be a contraindication. For lesser concerns, then that might merit a warning or a precaution.
Right. Is that usually something that is voted on by an advisory committee? Those specifics.
Typically, no. Those are handled through labeling.
Right. Okay. Let's go on to next, Mr. Taubman.
Yes, thank you. So I'm going to ask the committee or the other members to listen to this. I'm a civil rep, so maybe I'm a good indicator of how things are perceived by the public, but I have spent a lot of time reviewing the material, trying to understand the data, and in light of concerns with the data expressed by my colleagues, many commentators, and in the literature, I do have a compromise proposal that's not the whole thing that was just suggested or is in the question. but rather it would be that EUA be limited to the groups that the CDC's ACIP committee has already identified as priority. And the data is limited, as we know. It's limited in so many ways. The severe disease thing that I was talking about before, it's not compelling at all. I mean, FDA says all we can do is suggest protection from severe COVID-19 disease. We need to know that it does that. So that's one bit of data we need to get. The safety issues are only 2 months of data, and I know it's been said many times that 6 weeks is usually the amount of time before we have a problem, but this is a completely untested technology with this vaccine in humans. And then the FDA says as far as a vaccine-enhanced disease over time, that's unknown. So there's there's a few of the missing pieces of data. Given that we don't have good data on effectiveness on the thing that really matters, which is preventing severe disease, and the safety issues, and that there's a question of duration of protection, which more time would give us, I think that we absolutely need, as other people have said, phase 2 to 3 trials to continue. And we've also discussed at length how if you grant EUA broadly, then it's going to really present a problem. I know that there's workarounds, and I understand it makes sense. The blinded crossover, you still are going to lose at that point thereafter the placebo benefit. It's been suggested by Pfizer and others that we can go with the standard that wait until the people in the study will only be told and unblinded or offered the crossover option if it is authorized for their particular demographic to get the vaccine at that point. But what's been talked about is state and local standards. And as Dr. Lee pointed out, that is really problematic and variable. And I can tell you as an advocate on the state level, we can lobby successfully to get things changed on the state level. And maybe that's not so good. Maybe you need a clear standard of EUA. And as I pointed out earlier, a lot of the trial participants who are writing to us and complaining are viewing if EUA is granted, and that means I should get it. We can disagree with that. But clearly, if EUA is officially granted initially only for the 2 high-risk groups, which is identified by the CDC, which was the healthcare workers and the nursing home residents, to start, that will give us time, give FDA time to review more thoroughly the data. It can be just a few weeks. And they could either come back to this committee or on their own decide, okay, we now have enough to go forward and expand it to a larger population. And the reason I'm suggesting it is obviously because the risk-benefit analysis changes, and you're talking about the high-risk populations versus the rest, given all the uncertainty. And the other piece of it is that we know there's just not enough to go around. So even if you agree to what I'm saying, it makes no difference in terms of what's going to happen on the ground in terms of getting vaccine out, because it's only going to go initially to the healthcare workers and the nursing home residents anyway. But the reason why I think it's important is that it will allow FDA the opportunity to get real data. I did ask for the data since November 14th to today just on severe disease. We know there were only 10 cases before November 14th, and I couldn't get, when I asked, more recent data. I'm sure Pfizer today, right now, knows how many severe cases there were since November 14th in both groups. But that's the kind of data we really need to see, I think, and that's why I'm suggesting it.
Boron?
Yeah, I'd like to make one point about this question of severe disease. I think it's important, and it was covered to some extent at the last VRBPAC meeting in October. And that's that we have ample experience of examples of vaccines that protect just as well, if not better, against severe disease as they do against mild to moderate disease. And so protection against disease of any severity is actually a pretty good predictor of protection against severe disease. We have a pretty strong result in terms of efficacy with this vaccine based on the available data. And those data that we do have for severe disease are all pointing in the right direction and corroborate what history has shown us. I think that's important to...
Not only that, as we'll get more data as we start using the vaccine more extensively, because with rare outcomes, you have to start using the vaccine in order to see them under proper circumstances. I'd like to move on to Dr. Meisner, who's got the next question.
Thank you. I would like to concur with what Dr. Fink just said, that if a vaccine prevents mild disease, I think we can assume it will prevent severe disease. So I understand that's the most important endpoint, but because of the rarity of the disease, severe disease, it may be difficult to reach that. The other point I wanted to make about long-term safety. We know about the safety of this vaccine through 60 days. And it's pretty hard to think of a vaccine reaction that occurs after 60 days. And I looked through the vaccine injury table for conventional vaccines, and all of the injuries, except for one, were only up to 6 weeks, not even 8 weeks. The one exception was a polio vaccine, a live polio vaccine administered to an immunocompromised host, and this is obviously not a live vaccine. So I think we cannot, no one could say that there is no long-term enhanced immunity when the vaccinee experiences the vaccine, but to me, that I think the safety is pretty well demonstrated, and balance that against over 2,000 deaths a day or 2,500 deaths a day, I'm comfortable. I would, if I can make one more point, Arnold, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Yes, I am uncomfortable about the question as it's written. I do not believe we have sufficient data for 16 and 17-year-olds. I would prefer to say for use in individuals 18 years of age and older. 16 and 17-year-old children, as we saw, or adolescents, do not get very sick, seldom get hospitalized, and I'll bet it's a very small number of deaths.
Bill, would you like to make a comment? And then I think we should talk about the 16 and 17-year-olds specifically. Bill?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a specific comment about vaccine safety and duration of follow-up, because I think one of the important things to remember when we're rolling out a vaccine to many people is that it's not just the side effects that the vaccine is causing that are important, but it may also be the vaccine side effects that are attributed to vaccine, but which the vaccine didn't actually cause, that are important. That's one of the reasons why we typically do follow people in clinical trials for 6 months or more, and where that placebo-controlled follow-up can be very important in showing that whatever happened in the vaccine group also happened in the placebo group, because that's our best way of knowing. And very often it's the fact that we have that placebo-controlled follow-up over time that gives us the ability to say that the vaccine didn't cause something at a longer period of time after vaccination. One could in fact argue that one could even get more placebo-controlled safety follow-up over the shorter run, which then could expand the total safety database. This was proposed at a WHO meeting a few weeks ago, where as long as vaccine supplies are limited, there shouldn't be a prohibition against getting additional placebo-controlled follow-up in people who don't have immediate eligibility for vaccine, and that then could expand the safety database to a much larger number than even what one is capable of doing in these trials. But very often these kinds of studies work very much to the benefit of the manufacturers, because if one has this data, it actually allows one to say fairly definitively that a side effect that somebody thinks the vaccine is causing is not being caused by the vaccine. And of course, this is something that is a big concern with rapid rollout of a vaccine. This kind of thing caused big problems in 1975, 1976. The swine flu vaccine, where there were rapid cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome, where if there were more placebo-controlled data, one might even have been able to address that at a different level, although that would have required very many patients. But I'm just pointing out that it's not just the 2 months follow-up in these phase 3 trials, which are important, but really placebo-controlled safety follow-up can play a big role in helping us determine what the vaccine doesn't cause, which is often at least as important as our ability to determine what it does cause.
Thank you, Dr. Cross.
Thank you. Does anybody in particular want to talk about the 16 and 17-year-old issue? I think that's an important one to get settled because it may be affecting how people would like to vote on this.
Yes, this is Ofer Levy. I want to speak to that issue. Is that okay?
Yeah, please.
Okay.
And then Dr. Gans.
Yeah, so a complicated topic, and it can be argued either way. Cody correctly pointed out that the incidence of severe COVID at 16, 17 years of age is not high. On the other hand, we've already heard from Pfizer, and this is quite typical, that if they do eventually want to get a pediatric indication and the end game could look, we don't know, we don't have a crystal ball, but it's possible if you demonstrate safety in pediatrics that eventually you get this as a pediatric vaccine and it's incorporated into the pediatric immunization schedule. That is a very practical model because that's how most vaccines are distributed around the world through the infrastructure of vaccinology. So in terms of achieving population penetration. So the loss, if we take away the 16 and 17-year-olds here, we lose what is the effort to climb down in age eventually, and we might lose one of our tools to eventually really conquer this pandemic. So I'm not so sanguine about removing that group.
Dr. Gans.
Can I respond?
Dr. Meister, go ahead. Yep,
yes,
go ahead.
Thank you, Ofer. It's a very interesting point. So I think you're suggesting that if the 16 and 17-year-old subjects are not included, then that will delay a approval or authorization for young children? I don't think that's the case. You're muted.
Phone is muted. Okay, hi. It will reduce the amount of information we have about the 16 and 17-year-olds. It will slow down getting the vaccine to them, and if we don't have that information, makes it that much harder to go down in age beyond that. So I'm thinking about what the end game here is for the entire world.
Yes.
What's realistic here, as we know, these viruses don't know national borders. What's realistic is getting vaccines eventually that are safe and effective through the typical vaccine infrastructure in the world. Most vaccines are delivered in early life.
But but we don't know if the benefit outweighs the risk in that 2-year age group, Ofer.
Yeah,
okay,
but
there were, let me interrupt. There were data in our briefing documents about studies going down to, I think, 12 years of age. If anything, there were larger numbers there than in some of the in the 16 and 17-year-olds. Anybody?
I'm sorry, Dr. Levy, I don't know why are you saying that a vaccine would have to have an emergency use authorization in 16-year-olds when where they're not going to be in the group that's going to get the vaccine. They're not going to be prioritized, but they'll continue to be studied in the trial. So I don't see how this interferes with the eventual full licensure for that age group.
I think that's the important point here is like when they come into the phase. I think it's very important to study this group, and I think that we will have ongoing data on them. The question is, does the risk benefit actually outweigh it at this point? And being a pediatrician, and Ofer knows this very well, I'm obviously a big proponent of any kind of studies that we can get into children, and we certainly need it for herd immunity. But they're not going to be first in line, and I do think we should allow the studies to continue that have been proposed and probably allow the people who have already been vaccinated to actually have full safety data. So I would support not including them in this round.
Other pediatricians, Dr. Sawyer, did you have something you were?
Yes,
Dr. Chatterjee?
Thank you. I've been trying to get in for a while to put in a word in it.
Yeah, well, it's hard.
I agree completely with what Dr. Gans and Dr. Meissner said. I have the same concern, which is among all the scientific data presented, I thought that the thinnest was for the 16 and 17-year-olds who, if they were eligible under this EUA, would not be granting permission themselves. You know, their parents are responsible, so they're not making the decision themselves, decision themselves to get vaccinated or not. The other group I had concerns with was the people who are 75 and older, but because of the very high risk for that group, I think it's reasonable to not put an upper limit on the age, but I too would vote for putting that age limit up to 18 and older.
This is Mark. I would like to just join that lineup of people advocating for that. I think the data is very thin and that it's inadequate to really say we have safety given the low incidence of disease. I know the argument was they're going to be going off to college, but I'm not sure how many are going to receive vaccine between now and then given the staging of release of vaccines. So I would favor delay.
Dr. Rubin, and then I'm going to ask FDA to respond. I think you're muted.
I'm not a pediatrician, so I say this with some trepidation, but we're looking at lots of subgroups here. And I think we don't want to lose sight of, we're very focused on safety, as we should be, because these are healthy people, but the efficacy is overwhelming for this vaccine. It's very, very strong. And remember that we're going to be voting, if we vote for this, to approve this for Native Americans, and there were very few of those, for nursing home residents, which weren't in the study at all, and we think that it's likely to work as compared, and it's likely to be safe because what we know, there are more 16 and 17-year-olds in the study than there are Native Americans, I suspect, and I'm not sure why we wouldn't want to provide clinicians the option of using those. Some of these kids are working in supermarkets and are going to be AMTs and going to be essential workers. So I hate to take that tool away from clinicians.
Can I comment, Arnold?
Yes, please, and then we want to hear from FDA what they would suggest at this point.
Thank you very much for your comment, Dr. Fink. I think the difference, for example, between American Indians and children is American Indians have a high rate of disease. 16 and 17-year-old children do not have high rates of disease. So it becomes a risk-benefit balance that worries me.
Arnold, at some point, as another pediatrician, I'd like to chime in as the last pediatrician to chime in. Here's what I would say. I think I support the statement actually as written. I think it's never an issue of when do you know everything. The question is when do you know enough. We certainly know that this vaccine is highly effective for 3 months after dose 1. We know that we have a lot of safety data and can say, as Cody pointed out, that at least we don't have a relatively uncommon serious side effect problem. And in terms of safety, we're going to be doing follow-up to make sure that issues like bells or anaphylaxis will be attended to. I mean, the fact of the matter is 16 and 17-year-olds can get this infection when they get it. I mean, we've seen certainly reports as well as children in our hospital who have had cardiac anomalies as 16 and 17-year-olds. And if you can prevent this disease safely and effectively, I mean, we have clear evidence of benefit. And all we have on the other side is theoretical risk. So I frankly would support this as written, and I agree with Dr. Rubin.
Can I respond to Paul? Arnold, I think...
Yes, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yes, Paul, the rates of Miss-C, at least as far as we know, and as was published in the New England Journal, regarding New York State, the rates of Miss-C were 2 cases per 100,000 people under 20 years of age.
Right, but I'm not just saying this C. I mean, there's also vasculitis that doesn't necessarily meet the operational criteria for Miss-C.
Well, and that is certainly true, but I'm just saying that the rate of disease is so small and we know so little in this age group. It's real. Believe me, we've had them too. But I have a little more trouble justifying it in children who are so unlikely to get disease.
Can we hear somebody from FDA, Doron or Phil?
Amanda's a pediatrician.
Comment on this? No, I'd just like to hear what, or Marion, come on.
Okay, this is Marion. So I think, I really don't want to throw in my own opinion on this. I hear the committee's concern. I just think that, as Dr. Fink has discussed earlier on, our laws and regulations do also permit, extrapolations to younger age groups. And we have been, I think, pretty forthcoming even in our briefing document that we would support, an extrapolation. One should also, consider that 16 and 17-year-olds are out there. They may, transmit disease. And the last comment that I wanted to make on this one is really, if the argument is made that 16 and 17 years old are really not the ones who are high-risk group and who would get in line to get this disease because they're not within the recommended group, I think you can make the same argument for an 18 to 25-year-old. So to me, I don't find that compelling. I wonder, however, looking at it is 5:30, and Arnold, we have a strategy. I would like, provided that other committee members do no longer want to weigh in, I would like for the committee to really vote on this question as is, to really hear, because we have 23 members, and I would like to see the results, and then we go to next. Arnold, that's my recommendation.
Okay, that is, thank you very much. I was hoping for some direction because we are moving around in circles right now. So we are going to move to the vote. And again, the process is going to be this. We will vote on our computers. The votes will be announced, and then we will have an explanation of vote from those who wish to give an explanation of their vote. Okay? Kathleen, am I correct in the process?
Yes. Thank you, Dr. Monteau. So our members and temporary voting members that you'll be able to see on this slide, excluding the industry representative, will be voting in this meeting. And in regards to the voting process, Dr. Monteau, as you mentioned, you'll read the question for the record, and then afterwards, all members and temporary voting members will cast their vote by selecting one of the voting options, which will include yes, no, or abstain. You'll have 2 minutes to cast your vote after the question is read, and once all of the votes have been placed, we will broadcast the results and read the individual votes aloud for the record. So just please note that you have 2 minutes, the time frame, and you can change your vote within that period of time, but after the vote has closed, all votes will be considered final. So are there any questions related to voting?
Kathleen, can I ask a question? Cody Meissner? Yes.
Please.
I want to vote for this vaccine. just would like to remove the 16 to 6. I don't want to vote against the EUA just because I'm uncomfortable with 16. Can we modify the wording if this doesn't pass?
I think that's what Dr. Gruber was saying. Marion, would you confirm that?
Yes.
I thought we just said we were not going to modify the wording so that we could get to a vote.
I would recommend voting on this question as is for now because we have not heard from all the committee members.
Thank you, Dr. Gruber.
Kathleen, can I ask one last question before we vote? The way
If it's related to the voting process, sure.
Well, it
Only
is.
about the voting process, not the question. Okay, I think we are going to vote. So
great. So let's pull up the voting question on the slide, and Dr. Monto, you can read. Question for the record.
Based on the totality of scientific evidence available, do the benefits of the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine outweigh its risks for use in individuals 16 years of age and older? Your vote possibilities are yes or no, and if you want to abstain, you just don't vote. Is that it? Because I thought there was an abstention possibility.
There's an abstain selection. The no vote just shows your name if you haven't made a selection.
Okay, so we have 2 minutes to vote.
Yes, go ahead and please cast your vote.
How do we return the vote to you? Can you see what we've voted?
Yes, once you select the radio button, I can see the votes. Mm-hmm. We have 1 minute remaining. Thirty seconds. Okay, at this time, the 2 minutes is up, so if we could please close the vote and broadcast the results. And I will read the votes aloud for the record. Dr. Moore voted yes. Dr. Cohn voted yes. Dr. Gans voted yes. Dr. Perlman voted yes. Dr. Kurilla voted no. Dr. Rubin voted yes. Dr. Levy voted yes. Dr. Pergam voted yes. Dr. Chatterjee voted no. Dr. Fuller voted no. Dr. Miser abstained. Dr. Sawyer voted yes. Dr. Hildreth voted yes. Dr. Kim voted no. Dr. Monto voted yes. Dr. Tripp voted yes. Dr. Wharton voted yes. Dr. Benacoloke voted yes. Dr. Offit voted yes. Dr. McInnes voted yes. Dr. Lee voted yes. Mr. Taubman voted yes. And that concludes the vote. So we do have a favorable vote, and that concludes this portion of the meeting. So I will now hand the meeting back over to Dr. Monto. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Marion, do you have anything you want to add at this point?
We can't hear you, Marion.
I apologize, double muted. I just wanted to thank the committee for voting on this very complex topic. I wanted to thank the committee for their discussion and their suggestions. We very much appreciate their input on this very important topic, and we will take what we've heard today into consideration when deciding on not only the EUA issuance here, but also, how to move on in the development of and licensure of this product. Thank you so much.
And therefore, our work for the day is done. I wanted to thank the committee, and I want especially to thank the FDA because they have been laboring long and hard in doing the analysis, dealing with some of the issues such as the recent anaphylaxis episodes. And I will therefore close the meeting, and I believe most of us are going to be revisiting some of these issues in about a week. So thank you very much. Good night, and see you soon.
It's so you have limited data